These Asians were brought by British.
Born into abject poverty in colonial Uganda, Idi Amin, not having much luck and direction in life, decided to join the British colonial army. At the time, no one would have predicted that this man will not only rule the country, but also become a problem for Uganda, the British Empire, and the world at large. Most see him as a dictator and tyrant, while others see him as a Pan-African leader that boosted the morale of his people and eradicated British rule and colonial caste systems that are designed to leave the black people of Uganda in poverty. He struck fear in the hearts of the Jewish and Asian communities in his country. Idi Amin was a brutal dictator who killed many of his own people, exiled the Jewish and Indian people from his country, and alienated the Western countries. He became a subject of many movies, as people were left fascinated by his life stories. In the end, he ran away from the empire he built, left it all behind to seek refuge on the other side of the world. This is the rise and fall of Idi Amin. In the 1900s, the scramble for the colonization of Africa by Western powers was well underway. All the Western powers wanted a piece of the pie in the African continent. This was the time that many influential African leaders that fought for the end of colonialism would be born. In 1925, Idi Amin Dada was born. Formal records have not been kept in most parts of Africa at the time, so his exact year of birth has been disputed. His father, Andres Nyabire, a member of the Kakwa ethnic group, converted from Christianity to Islam in 1910 and changed his name to Amin Dada. The Kakwa is an Islamic tribe that had settled in the region. His mother was of the Lukbara tribe. Both tribes fall under the umbrella of what the Ugandans call Nubian. These two tribes are ethnically related, and it's with the Nubians that Idi Amin's loyalty would lie throughout his life. Idi Amin's parents separated when he was very little. Abandoned by his father at a young age, he grew up with his mother's side of the family. His mother was a traditional herbalist who treated members of some royal families at the time. Idi Amin and his mother moved to the city. He was enrolled in a Muslim school, but he left the school after 4th grade. His formal English education is similar to that of a 4th grader. He had a tough life growing up. He survived the streets by selling snacks and doing casual work to earn a living. Growing up poor and living the life of hardships, nothing would have prepared him for the life of luxury that he would encounter in the future. During colonial times, it was very hard for black people to get jobs in Uganda. The skilled jobs were given to Indian and Jewish people, who were more skilled than the black people. So even a skilled black man found it hard to get a job.
The Indians first moved into the interior of Africa at the turn of the century, when the British built a railway from Mombasa on the coast to Uganda. The descendants of the railway workers and the traders who followed laid the foundation of the Asians' wealth. The grand houses on the outskirts of Kampala are owned by Asians, not Africans. Gradually, the Asians began to enter the professions and to fill the middle ranks of the civil service. Today, they're the main investors in industry, and their religion and culture are an established part of the East African scene.
Idi Amin grew very tall in his teenage years. The bigger a lion is in the animal kingdom, the more power it has. This gives the lion more mating rights and influence, and it bears the responsibility for protecting the pride. Likewise, with an imposing height of 6 feet 4 inches tall, the ability to speak the local Kiswahili language, and lack of education, Idi Amin was the perfect person for the British colonial powers to mold into an obedient soldier. So, as a young adult, he worked hard to garner the martial arts qualifications valued by the British, which had ruled Uganda since 1894. After enlisting in the army in 1946, Idi Amin successfully stood out from his peers by focusing on his strong suits: athletics. The young soldier was an impressive swimmer, rugby player, and boxer. As an amateur, Idi Amin won the Ugandan Light Heavyweight Boxing Championship in 1951 and held onto the title for 9 years straight. Meanwhile, in 1949, he was promoted from private to corporal. It was the first of his many notable steps up the ladder of power. In the early 1950s, Idi Amin helped the British maintain control of its African protectorates by fighting against the Mau Mau freedom fighters in Kenya and the rebels in Somalia. At this stage of his life, he was helping maintain the British colonial status quo. This was quite the opposite of who he would become in his late years.
You see, the British were smart. They used the African colonial soldiers to fight other Africans and do all the dying for them. And this is a tactic that the British colonial soldiers have used throughout their colonies.
As a soldier, Idi Amin was ruthless. He used ruthless methods to conquer his opponents, and this was a valuable trait that the British wanted. He quickly began to garner a reputation as a ruthless soldier and steadily rose through the military ranks. In 1957, he was promoted to Sergeant Major and commanded his own platoon. 2 years later, he was given the rank Ifendi, the highest rank available to native-born soldiers in Uganda. By 1962, Idi Amin had the highest rank of any African in the military. Unbeknownst to the British colonial masters, they have created a powerful monster that is too big for them. But with all this power, influence, and money, no one could have been prepared of what Idi Amin would become. As Uganda approached independence, Idi Amin's close colleague Milton Obote, the leader of the Uganda People's Congress, was made Prime Minister. Obote played a crucial role on the road to the country's independence. Obote had Idi Amin, one of only 2 high-ranking Africans in the King's African Rifles, appointed as the 1st Lieutenant of the Ugandan Army. Idi Amin and Prime Minister Obote formed a lucrative alliance in 1964, rooted in an expansion of the Ugandan army and various illegal smuggling operations. In 1962, Idi Amin was sent north to quell the cattle stealing problem the country had faced. But this was a mistake. Idi Amin committed brutal atrocities. The victims have been tortured and beaten to death. Some had been buried alive. This shocked everyone, since he was one of only 2 high-ranking African officers, and Uganda was nearing its October 9, 1962 independence from Britain. Obote and the British officials decided not to prosecute him. Instead, Obote promoted him and sent him to the UK for further military training.
He thought that he could re-educate Idi Amin and change his ways. But this decision turned out to be the single worst decision that Milton Obote has ever made.
Meanwhile, Milton Obote further promoted Idi Amin to Major in 1963 and to Colonel in 1964. By 1966, the Ugandan Parliament charged Idi Amin with misappropriating $350,000 worth of gold and ivory from the guerrillas in the Congo that he was supposed to supply arms with. In response, Idi Amin's forces arrested 5 ministers who raised the issue. Then, Milton Obote suspended the constitution, appointing himself president. Days later, Idi Amin was put in charge of Uganda's entire military and police force. 2 months later, Obote sent the tanks to attack the palace of Mutisa II, Uganda's local king and force president, with whom he shared power. The king fled the country, leaving Obote in charge of the government and Idi Amin in charge as the government's muscle. But Milton Obote will not last in power for long. Idi Amin wants the country for himself. And since he has control of the military, this makes him more powerful than the president. A serious mistake. After Idi Amin was put in charge of the entire army, he began to strengthen his position within the army, using the funds obtained from smuggling and from supplying arms to rebels in South Sudan. While he obeyed Milton Obote's orders to the letter, Idi Amin has his personal ambitions up his sleeve. For example, he was recruiting hundreds of his kingsmen to the army. These were to come in handy later, when he decided to take over high office. Among these include the Sudanese and Congolese. By the early 1970s, he had created a sizable force within the Ugandan army that could answer to his whims, and Obote recognized this too. He also developed ties with the British and Israeli agents in the country. President Obote first responded by putting Idi Amin under house arrest in order to quell his power. When this failed to work, he was sidelined to a non-executive position in the army. On January 25, 1971, while Obote was attending a meeting in Singapore, Idi Amin led a successful coup, taking control of the country and declaring himself president. Idi Amin was initially welcomed both within Uganda and by the international community, especially the British government in England. Ugandans were generally enthusiastic about Idi Amin taking control. To them, the new president wasn't merely a military leader, but a charismatic man of the people. The people danced in the streets in celebration. He wasted no opportunity to shake hands, pose for pictures, and dance the traditional dances with the commoners. His people thought that he would be a better leader for the country. He was also polygamous. He had multiple wives. His spouses were of various Ugandan ethnic groups, and this helped him to gain more support from different tribes. But the biggest boost to his popularity came when he allowed King Mutesa's body to return to Uganda for burial in his homeland, abolished Obote's secret police, and granted amnesty to political prisoners. Unfortunately, Idi Amin was not the benevolent ruler he appeared to be. Idi Amin was paranoid, and he didn't trust the soldiers loyal to the former president.
He was scared that something can happen to his life because how he was ruling. People were scared of him, and also he was scared of the people.
So in secret, he created his killer squads to hunt down and kill those soldiers. They reportedly killed 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers right there in the military barracks. To some people, it quickly became apparent that Idi Amin's man of the people persona was no more than a front to hide his true intentions. He was ruthless, vindictive, and used military clout to further his goals. But this is just the beginning.
And the methods employed by Amin's police are extremely brutal. Victims are clubbed to death, burned in the savannah, their bodies thrown to the crocodiles in the Nile, or shot publicly, wearing white aprons to highlight the blood. choked with their own penises stuffed down their throats, and some even dynamited in groups.
By this time, the black people of Uganda were at the lower class of the hierarchical system left by the British. At the upper class were the white British people. Then, the middle class was filled by the Jewish and Indian people. Then, of course, at the lower class of the pyramid was the black people of Uganda. Idi Amin didn't like this.
One characteristic of Idi Amin was that he was very blunt. If he wanted to tell you something, he would tell you, raw, unfiltered. And as you might expect, most people didn't like this, especially the Western countries.
And so, he kicked out the Jewish people of Uganda out of his country. At this time, some of his military advisors were Jewish as well, and so he expelled them as well.
Uganda's Israeli community, all 700 of whom were expelled last March and given only a week to get out. The reason was President Amin's new friendship with Libya's General Gaddafi.
But then, he turned to Muammar Gaddafi and the Soviet Union for help. He also gave the Indian population of Uganda just 90 days to leave his country, or else it would be the worst experience that they ever had in their life. And the Indian people had British passports, and they were very scared. They believed him, because at this point, Idi Amin already had a reputation for being ruthless. The Indian population were working harder than the ant colonies to get out of his country. They owned many businesses, and they were ordered to abandon it and leave. So they did. And the abandoned businesses were handed over to Idi Amin's supporters.
The responsibility of Asians in Uganda, it is the responsibility of Great Britain. Thank you very much.
Uganda's President, General Idi Amin, makes it clear that he expects Britain to look after the Asians of Uganda, whom he no longer wants. Ever since the President's decision to expel all Asians who are not Ugandan citizens, the British High Commission in Kampala has been besieged by thousands of Asians trying to clarify their national status and seeking assurance that they'll be allowed to enter Britain. About 80,000 Asians will have to leave.
He also severed diplomatic ties with Britain and nationalized 85 British-owned businesses.
Now this is a quick note. It takes me a very long time and a lot of money to make these videos. And it costs you nothing to hit the subscribe button. So please do. I need 1,000 subscribers to start making ad revenue on YouTube. Thank you very much for doing that. Now, let's continue with the story.
Even though Milton Obote was ousted from power by Idi Amin, he never gave up hope to once again become the president of Uganda. When Idi Amin had a successful coup, Milton Obote ran to Tanzania for refuge. In 1972, while Obote was in Tanzania, he attempted unsuccessfully to regain the country through a military coup. Obote's supporters within the Ugandan army, predominantly from the Akoli and Lango ethnic groups, were also involved in the coup. Idi Amin responded by bombing Tanzanian towns and purging the military of Akoli and Lango officers. The ethnic violence grew to include the entire army, and then Ugandan civilians. As Idi Amin became increasingly paranoid, the violence was brutal. The Nile Mansions Hotel in Kampala became infamous as Idi Amin's interrogation and torture center, and he is said to have moved residences regularly to avoid assassination attempts. His killer squads were responsible for tens of thousands of abductions and murders. Idi Amin personally ordered the execution of the Anglican Bishop of Uganda, the Chancellor of Makerere College, and the Governor of the Bank of Uganda, and several of his own parliamentary ministers. In June 1976, Idi Amin made one of his most infamous decisions by aiding Palestinian and leftist militants who hijacked an Air France flight from Tel Aviv to Paris. A strong critic of Israel, he allowed the hijackers to land in Entebbe airport in Uganda and provided them with troops and supplies as they held 246 passengers and 12 crew members hostage. But instead of giving up, Israel has sent a team of elite commandos to rescue the hostages in a surprise attack on Entebbe airport during the night of July 3rd, in what turned out to be one of the most daring and successful rescue missions in history. 101 out of 105 remaining hostages were liberated. Only one Israeli soldier lost his life during the operation, while all 7 hijackers and 20 Ugandan soldiers were killed. After an embarrassing turn of events, Idi Amin ordered the execution of one of the hostages, a 74-year-old British-Israeli woman who had fallen ill during the hostage crisis and was being treated in a Ugandan hospital. The woman, Dora Bloch, was dragged from her hospital bed and shot to death, then dumped into the trunk of a government car. The body was later found on a sugar plantation, but it was too burned and disfigured to be identified, prompting the British to sever all diplomatic ties with Uganda in the aftermath of the Entebbe incident. Idi Amin believed that the British never fully left his country, and they are still being ruled by them. So when they severed all ties with his country, he called himself the conqueror of the British Empire.
You've said you wanted to teach Britain a lesson, President. Why is that? Does this mean the end of the friendship with Britain you've had?
And that is now a lesson I'm teaching the British.
He obliges British businessmen to kneel and declare allegiance to him. He has his throne carried by 4 white men.
But his ruthless ways will soon lead to his own downfall. The deteriorating economy of Uganda also didn't help. Prices for coffee, Uganda's main export, plummeted in the 1970s. In 1978, the US, which accounted for 1/3 of Uganda's coffee exports, stopped trading with Uganda altogether. With a deteriorating economy and popular opposition to his rule, Idi Amin's hold on power was growing increasingly weak. By this point, many Ugandans had fled to the UK and other African countries, while many of his troops had quietly fled to Tanzania. Just like a snake whose head has been cut off, Milton Obote refuses to die, and he vows to regain presidency of Uganda once again. Since Milton Obote was in Tanzania, Idi Amin decided to finish him once and for all. In October 1978, with the assistance of Libyan troops, Idi Amin attempted to annex Kagera, the northern province of Tanzania. The area shares a border with Uganda. In an unexpected turn of events, Tanzanian forces not only fought off the attack but invaded Uganda. Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere responded by sending troops to Uganda. On April 11, 1979, Tanzania and exiled Ugandan soldiers captured Uganda's capital, Kampala, overthrowing Idi Amin's regime. Given his connections with Gaddafi, Idi Amin first fled to Libya, taking his 4 wives and more than 30 children along with him. He stayed in Libya for almost 10 years. Eventually, they moved to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. He was welcomed by the Muslim countries because he was one of their own, and he stood against the Israeli occupation of Palestine. As long as they were concerned, no one would touch him under their watch. They gave him all the protection he needed. He remained there in exile for the remainder of his life. On August 16, 2003, Idi Amin died in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. The cause of death was reported as multiple organ failure. Although the Ugandan government announced that his body could be buried in Uganda, he was quickly buried in Saudi Arabia. The Islamic religion dictates that dead bodies be quickly buried. This is why they did that. Let me remind you that Idi Amin was liked by the Western countries. They even supported his coup done against Milton Obote. England thought that he would be better than Obote, and they would have more special privileges with him, so they supported him. After they discovered that Idi Amin didn't support Western interests, they then flipped the script and their love turned to hate. Since he was not nice towards them, they decided to implement sanctions against him and his country. In reality, both Milton Obote and Idi Amin committed human rights violations, but the West chose to ignore the crimes done by Obote, and they put a spotlight on the crimes of Idi Amin and sensationalized him to the rest of the world. They made many movies about him. Idi Amin was a monster created by the British. He fought their wars against the African people that were fighting for independence. He was very brutal all along. In fact, the British taught him this. But when he later turned against them, they decided to suddenly have a problem with him. They painted him as the villain he was all along.